Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a deeply fascinating, honestly kind of dark piece of history. We're looking at how human behavior deliberately erased some of Earth's most incredible animals. And to be clear, we aren't talking about random acts of nature or freak meteor strikes here. We're tracking a historical roadmap to see exactly how we managed to make seemingly permanent fixtures of our planet just disappear entirely.
There's this concept that really sticks with me. It says, every extinction is a choice repeated thousands of times. The extinctions we are about to explore today, they were absolutely not accidents. They were the result of active, sustained choices, compounded over decades and even centuries. And by really understanding these choices, we can get a much better grip on our own modern relationship with the natural world.
All right, let's dive into Section 1, the illusion of infinite abundance. So, historically, some animals were so incredibly plentiful, humanity literally couldn't fathom their end. Which begs a pretty staggering question. How on earth do you erase the most numerous bird on the planet? I want you to genuinely imagine trying to wipe out a species that once blackened the sky from horizon to horizon, because that was the reality of the passenger pigeon in North America.
5 billion. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the estimated population of the passenger pigeon at its absolute peak. It's a staggering figure. The ground beneath their roosting areas would literally be carpeted inches deep in droppings, and thick tree branches would actually snap under their collective weight. I mean, to have a population of 5 billion and drop all the way to zero, it almost seems mathematically impossible. To really grasp this kind of abundance, the famous naturalist John James Audubon once noted a single flock passing overhead for 3 consecutive days. 3 days! But this massive scale was actually their Achilles heel. They required these enormous communal flocks to trigger successful reproduction. And we aggressively hunted them. We shot them, netted them, smoked them out of their roosts to sell as cheap protein for the 19th century working class, all while rapidly clearing their forest habitats. Once we fragmented that population below a critical threshold, they simply couldn't sustain themselves anymore.
So, the crucial takeaway here is just how quickly 5 billion became just 1. All of that immense biological wealth was reduced to a single lonely female named Martha. She died entirely alone in her enclosure at the Cincinnati Zoo on September 1, 1914, before her body was literally frozen in a block of ice and shipped off to the Smithsonian.
And we see a very similar illusion of abundance with the aurochs. Julius Caesar himself actually described them in his writings as barely smaller than an elephant. The aurochs was this towering 2,200-pound wild ancestor of every single domestic cow on Earth today. They were this continent-spanning megafauna, the kind you see painted on the ancient walls of the Lascaux caves. But as human agriculture spread, we fragmented their habitat. Our domestic cattle spread diseases to them. European nobles turned hunting them into this massive status symbol. Rather than managing them, we drove this mighty beast into a tiny pocket of Poland, where the last known female died in 1627. Think about that. We farmed them into 1 billion domestic descendants, but let the wild original species vanish completely.
Moving right along, Section 2, Islands of Fatal Trust. Okay, shifting from the mainland to isolated environments, let's immediately correct a massive historical slander. The dodo has basically become a casual punchline for stupidity, right? But the reality is that the dodo was actually a lean, athletic pigeon relative living on the island of Mauritius. And here's the thing, that island had exactly 0 native land predators. So when Dutch sailors arrived in the 1590s, the dodos just walked right up to them. That isn't stupidity, it's practical evolution. They had literally no evolutionary reason to fear anything walking on 2 legs. The real killers weren't even the sailors, honestly. It was the rats, the pigs, and the cats they brought with them, which completely decimated the ground-nesting dodo eggs in just a few short decades.
Now, this brilliantly and tragically illustrates the shocking speed of extinction when fatal trust meets commercial exploitation. Steller sea cow was discovered in 1741 by stranded explorers. These were massive, 30-foot kelp eaters, and they were entirely docile. But what's really heartbreaking is their compassion. When one was harpooned, others in the herd would actually swim close and attempt to shield it with their own bodies. Hunters easily exploited this. In just 27 years, literally a single human generation, the species went from its very first scientific documentation to total confirmed extinction by 1768.
And we did the exact same thing to the great auk in the North Atlantic.
Fun fact, the great auk was actually the original bird to be called a penguin. At 33 inches tall, they were extraordinary swimmers but absolutely hopeless walkers on land. Because they couldn't fly or run away, sailors literally just herded them up ramps onto ships like livestock. Entire breeding colonies were treated as a completely disposable, inexhaustible resource just for mattress feathers and oil. Which leads us to a truly devastating end. By the 1800s, the great auk was functionally rare, but instead of, trying to save them, wealthy natural history enthusiasts started paying top dollar for their skins and eggs. On June 3, 1844, on an island off Iceland, the final known breeding pair was killed. And to make matters worse, the female's incubating egg was accidentally crushed during the scuffle. The entire species was ended in a single morning, merely to satisfy a collector's perverse desire for rarity.
Okay, let's look at Section 3, Erased by Industry and Spite. This marks a real shift toward extinctions caused by modern economic convenience, completely flawed agricultural policies, and collateral industrial damage. Take the thylacine, for example, better known as the Tasmanian tiger. This was a magnificent carnivorous marsupial. It had this jaw that could open to a remarkable 80 degrees. Yet modern researchers point out that this jaw was likely completely unsuited for bringing down large prey like sheep. Despite this, European farmers blamed them entirely for sheep predation. So, what happened? The Tasmanian government instituted a state-funded bounty system, deliberately exterminating over 2,100 of them, purely for the economic convenience of the livestock industry. The last known thylacine died a completely banal, avoidable death in 1936 at the Hobart Zoo. It was accidentally locked out of its sleeping area on a freezing night.
Now, what's really incredible and terrifying here is that the baiji, which was this beautiful, pale blue freshwater river dolphin, was never actually actively hunted. In China, it was revered. They called it the goddess of the Yangtze. But a perfect storm of modern development just erased it. As China transformed industrially, the Yangtze River basically became a chaotic highway. These nearly blind dolphins were struck by boat propellers, they were deafened by the constant acoustic chaos of commercial shipping, and they were starved when the massive Three Gorges Dam radically altered the river's entire ecosystem. By 2006, the baiji became the first cetacean driven to extinction in recorded history, erased entirely by the collective weight of modern industry.
And finally, Section 4, Extinctions We Watched Happen.
These are the animals we lost while the modern conservation world watched. We were fully aware, yet somehow completely helpless to stop it. The western black rhino in Africa is basically our textbook example of how this builds into a modern tragedy. So, step 1, colonial trophy hunting severely decimates their numbers. Step 2, we actually see a minor conservation victory mid-century. Things look hopeful. But then, step 3, industrial-scale poaching explodes, driven entirely by black market demand for their horns. And by the way, those horns are made of keratin. That is the exact same biologically useless protein as your fingernails. Finally, step 4, the death blow. The last population lived in a national park in Cameroon, but there was just a complete lack of political will to stop entrenched corruption and enforce real protection. In 2011, they were officially declared extinct. We had the science, we had the money, we just didn't care enough to stop it. And that kind of systemic failure leaves us with some profoundly lonely final survivors. Habitat destruction and the exotic pet trade forced a brilliant blue parrot, the Spix's macaw, down to a single wild male. Researchers watched him fruitlessly try to mate with a completely different species of bird out of pure, desperate isolation before he vanished in 2000. And then there was Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise. Whalers and feral goats completely destroyed his island's ecosystem. George survived as this scientific curiosity in a research station for decades, literally the rarest creature in the world, until dying in 2012 at over 100 years old. Today, there are ambitious projects trying to breed plain zebras to look like the extinct quagga, or using biotechnology to try and bring back the thylacine. But we really have to realize something crucial. We can reconstruct an appearance through selective breeding or advanced genetics, but the unbroken chain of a true species, its behaviors, its generational memories, its specific place in a wild ecosystem, that is gone forever. So as we look at the natural world around us today, we have to ask ourselves, when the wild habitat is already paved over, are we actually saving these animals, or are we just preserving living ghosts? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really hope it leaves you looking at the wild world just a little bit differently.